What's up guys, Jay here and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to finally take a dive into build crafting and talk about some class builds that I've put together. A lot of people have been wanting some proper build videos on the channel for a while now, so I thought I would start with something simple but needed by much of the player base. Today I'm going to start relatively simple and go over an engineer build that is not only very effective, but highly accessible for new players, since it uses the base weapons with no overclocks or promotions needed, making it perfect for players just starting out. So if you guys are ready, here is my affectionately named Greenbeard build for the engineer class in Deep Rock Galactic. By the way, if you want to see more build videos or just more videos in general, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another video.
Time for a cold one once this is done.
This build is aimed at players just starting out who don't have a lot of resources at their disposal. As such, this build requires no overclocks or promotions in order to use effectively. As I stated, it's meant to be a Greenbeard focused build, so as such, it's only going to use the starter weapons and equipment, and I'm going to assume that you only have one passive and active perk slot available to use. The only real thing you need with this build is enough resources to unlock the upgrades in each tier, which shouldn't be too bad. Note that the recommendations that I give should not be viewed as the absolute undisputed choices for this build, but rather as a general guide to help you through the early stages of the game. As such, feel free to experiment with certain tweaks to the upgrade choices if you find that one works better for you. Also, just because I chose not to include overclocks in this build does not mean that they are not welcome. If you get one early on that you think would make this build better, then by all means just try it out. So now let's get into the gameplay of this particular build and how it's meant to be used. This build does a great job of teaching you the general playstyle of the engineer early on and help you get a feel for how to use his equipment. The engineer has a bit of a different playstyle than the other three classes, especially in the early game. The engineer can basically be played in two different ways, either focusing on very wide range crowd control options or extremely effective single target damage. This build kind of gives you a little bit of both of these playstyles to help you see the kinds of usefulness the engineer has to offer in both of those regards. You can use both of your weapons for either crowd control or single target DPS to see what kind of setup you want to go for later on. Since this is a Greenbeard build, the weapons that we are using are the Warthog shotgun and the Deep Core grenade launcher. However, these weapons, despite being the engineer's starters, are wildly effective, especially when paired together. The shotgun can be a very effective tool for sweeping swarms of enemies on its own, and when paired with your sentry gun using turret whip, it can also be used for single target damage, both directly or indirectly. The grenade launcher, on the other hand, shares a similar position, being more suited for AoE damage and crowd control using the setup that we have, but also being able to do good chunks of damage to those tougher boss enemies. The main goal involved with this build is essentially learning the way that the engineer handles situations. You're going to mainly be sticking with the rest of your team and supporting them as needed, using your platforms to help your team get around easier and get to those harder resources. When a swarm hits or when you just see a large group of enemies, you're going to throw your sentry down immediately and proceed to handle the enemies in whichever way suits your situation the best. This will usually involve starting with a grenade launcher shell in the middle of the enemy clusters to break them up, followed up with your shotgun to either pick off whatever enemies are left or use the turret whip to take out any tough enemies that may have survived. This is the bread and butter rotation for handling standard swarms, but depending on what types of enemies you are up against, it may alter slightly. While the grenade launcher is very good at clearing large groups, the ammo on it is not insane, even with the ammo upgrades we have equipped. So try not to be overly enthusiastic with your grenades unless you have either a very large group or a very tough enemy so as to not run out of ammo too fast. This build involves a lot of stopping and going as it excels at corralling the enemies into one place and unleashing your arsenal. So when you encounter a swarm, make sure you have a good defendable position. Also, don't forget when you are done with an encounter or swarm to make sure that you recall your sentries back to you to be ready for the next group. Outside of combat, you should look for any opportunity to use your platforms to help the team. The scout in particular is probably going to need you the most to get to those hard to reach minerals. So now going into the actual loadout of the build, first we have our perk choices, and again, since this is an early game, new player focused build, I'm assuming you only have one passive and active perk slot to work with and don't have your perk tree very highly unlocked. That being said, the perks for this particular build don't have a huge impact on gameplay at this level, so you have a little bit more leeway in this category. For passive perks, I would say Thorns is a great one to use early on because you can get it in the very first perk column, and it is useful especially against those tiny swarmers and Nadosite jellyfish. You could also run Resupplier if you work your way down the perk tree a little bit. That perk would be very useful as well, but it's in the third tier of perks, so you will have to work a little bit to get to it. Again, at this early stage, the passive perks especially aren't going to have a very huge impact, but these are the ones I would say have the most benefit early on. For active perks, you have some more useful options at your disposal. You have Field Medic, Heightened Senses, and See You in Hell in the first column, which are all very useful perks at the early level. For this build, I would say Heightened Senses would probably be the best choice to protect you from those rogue cave leeches, but you could really choose any of these and be okay. Now getting into the meat of the actual build with the weapons and equipment upgrades. We have a lot to get through, and we're actually going to start with a throwable grenade, which is the Lure. This is the first grenade that you have access to as the engineer, and honestly works very well for this build since we want the enemies to be gathered up, making it easy for us to either blast them with a grenade or a turret whip shot to break them up. It's useful to be able to throw this out and essentially take the bug pressure off of you for a set time. Moving on to the actual weapons and their upgrades, our primary is of course the Warthog Auto Shotgun. As I have stated many times before, this weapon is just a very solid all-around primary with good base stats and a surprisingly good range for a shotgun. So if you're just starting out with this build, know that this gun can and will take you very far. For our purposes, we want it to have a good amount of ammo and damage so that it can handle itself, as well as be able to use the turret whip ability frequently and effectively. In the first tier, I went with supercharged feed mechanism for that extra rate of fire, since it already has a decent magazine size and we want to be spitting out shots faster to either chew up swarms or fling out turret shots faster. The second tier, I chose expanded ammo bags since we want as many shots as we can fit for our own purposes. You could go with loaded shells if you want a little bit more damage, but honestly, if you're sticking to hazard level 2, which I would recommend for most new players, you shouldn't have a lot of trouble with damage output. The third tier is honestly up to you because none of these upgrades hold an insane amount of value in this setup, but I chose to go with faster reloads for less downtime in between cycles of firing. In tier 4, I went with bigger pellets for more raw damage since you don't run into armor that much of the time, and if you do, you could just use your turret whip or a grenade shot and handle it much faster. However, if you're going to say run an elimination mission or sabotage mission, then it may be worth switching for the extra armor shredding. Then lastly, in the 5th tier, we of course have turret whip. This is one of the core damage output upgrades and honestly feels like just a built-in overclock in my opinion. Essentially, if you don't know what it does, it allows you to shoot a round at your sentry gun to cause it to consume 5 of its ammo to fire a powerful explosive shot that deals heavy damage and shred armor in a wide area and stun whatever it hits. There's a 3-second cooldown between firing shots, so you can't spam it unfortunately. This is where the bulk of the shotgun's power comes into focus because you can essentially use the shotgun as an extra grenade launcher so long as you stay close to your sentry and it has ammo. It's surprising just how a few explosive turret shots can destroy a swarm, and this is going to be the bulk of what you are using your shotgun for in those tough situations. Moving over to the grenade launcher, our main goal with this weapon is to make it have wide angle coverage and as much damage as possible. First here, I actually went with the extra ammo. Even though the other two options are good and tempting, the biggest problem the grenade launcher has is its ammo reserves are not the greatest, so we don't want to burn through ammo too fast. The area of effect damage for this weapon is already pretty good, and we do improve it later on down the upgrade tree. On that note, in the second tier, I went with larger payload to accomplish that very task, giving this weapon the much wanted increase in area damage. This will help us clear those huge hordes of enemies even better than before. The third tier is a little more flexible between either incendiary compound or pressure wave. I wouldn't really use high velocity rounds here since it doesn't really increase our damage in any real way. For the most part, I would say use incendiary compound since we're not exactly worried about direct damage and the setting enemies on fire can be extremely effective. However, you can switch to the armor breaking if you do, say, an elimination or sabotage mission, for example, to help you with those dreadnoughts or caretaker corners. Then in the fourth tier, we have nails plus tape for even more area of effect damage. Remember that we're going for wide angle coverage to take out as many bugs as possible, so the extra stun and random damage increases from the other two options may be nice, but isn't really what we're going for. Finally, in the last tier, we actually went with proximity trigger. This essentially turns your grenades into slightly different versions of your proximity grenade by making it so that they have a very brief warm-up time and then detonate when enemies are near. What's more, it also increases your area of effect even further. This might be a little awkward to get used to at first in terms of knowing when to shoot, but when you do get into the rhythm, you'll see that it has the potential to do crazy AoE damage to a lot of enemies, especially since you're basically guaranteed to hit since the grenade doesn't go off until something passes by it. So your efficiency will be very good. Combining this plus the incendiary compound can spread wildfire like crazy to the entire swarm. Lastly, briefly going over the upgrades for the rest of the engineer's equipment. For the sentry gun, first I went with the Mark II upgrade instead of the Gemini system. You could honestly choose either one of these upgrades and be fine, but I didn't want to add too much micromanaging with this build with having to worry about 2 sentry ammo pools. You could in theory add way more damage using the turret whip and go back and forth between 2 sentries, but I felt like just the one was doing perfectly fine and didn't require too much attention. But if you wanted to do the double, you absolutely can. Then I chose the quick deployment in tier 2 because I just like the very fast building anything, but if you don't mind taking a few extra seconds, you could easily use the extra ammo here and be just fine. In tier 3, I have the expanded magazine, again for less micromanaging the sentries, but really any choice here wouldn't be bad and won't change the build too much. And finally, I chose the Hawkeye system in tier 4 just so that way I don't have to worry about placing the turret in a specific angle to shoot things. Plus you can use the laser pointer to have it fire at specific things to help you set up your turret whips very easily against those tough enemies in the crowd. For the platform gun, we have very simple choices for upgrades. In tier 1 and 3, we chose the extra ammo just to give you as many platforms as you can. And of course, you can only have the option of fall damage reduction in tier 2, so that's what we went with. Finally, for our armor rig, we have the improved generator at tier 1 to get your shields back faster, healthy in tier 2 to make us more durable, hazmat system is the only option in tier 3, and lastly breathing room in tier 4 to help us in a pinch if we do go down.
Identify targets and exterminate. That's how it's done.
So this build, as stated before, is meant for a very new player, but that doesn't mean that you can't keep it and simply expand on it. Remember, this build uses no overclocks, meaning that you can essentially put any overclocks onto either of these weapons and just improve what you already have. This build is very easy to add onto and adapt as you acquire more overclocks and equipment later on down the line. Along the same line, remember that I'm also assuming that you only have one passive and active perk, meaning that you can add really any other perks to this setup and only make it better. You could add on resupplier or elemental insulation or even deep pockets if you want. For active perks, remember that you do need to promote the class in order to access the second slot. But once you do, Field Medic, Beastmaster, or Iron Will would all be really good choices to run. Lastly, while the lure grenades do work well with this build, don't be afraid to try out the other ones once you unlock them, since the throwables don't play a huge part in this setup to this build. So giving my final thoughts on this build, honestly, it worked way better than I had anticipated. It's not going to delete bosses instantly or anything like that, but it allows you to cover a lot of different encounters, which is what you want to do at the early stages of the game. When trying out this build and getting all the footage you are seeing in the background, I was going through a promotion assignment as well as other missions and did all of them on hazard level 3, which isn't even the difficulty I would recommend for new players. So the fact that I was able to go through these missions without a crazy amount of trouble is impressive. So if you are someone new to the game and sticking to hazard level 2, as I would recommend, you should have no trouble going through these missions. Well, there you have the Greenbeard build for the engineer to help you work your way up the company ladder until you get to that end game content. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and are excited to see more build videos in the future, as I had a lot of fun making this one. If you guys want to see more new player focused builds like this or more advanced ones involving more overclocks and higher level strats, let me know down in the comments. Anyway, I hope you guys found this video helpful. Please be sure to give it a like because it tells me what types of videos you guys want to see. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time for another video.